Why should you care about a group of people who lived over 2,000 years ago in the cold forest of Europe? Because the way they saw the world, the way they celebrated, and the way they honored the dead still echoes through your own life every October. Every jack-o'-lantern you carve, every costume you wear, every ghost story you tell carries a thread that reaches back to them. Understanding the Celts means understanding why we do what we do when autumn arrives. So who were the Celts really? Not a single nation or empire, but a vast patchwork of tribes spread across what we now call Ireland, Scotland, Wales, England, France, Spain, and parts of Central Europe. They spoke related languages, shared similar beliefs, and followed customs that connected them even when they never met face to face. They had no written histories during their height. Everything they knew, they carried in memory. Stories, laws, genealogies, rituals, all passed from mouth to ear, generation after generation. This wasn't primitive. It was intentional. They believed some knowledge was too sacred, too powerful to trap in scratches on stone or wood. Their world was not our world. They lived close to the bone, close to the earth, close to forces we've forgotten how to feel. Survival depended on reading the land, the sky, the seasons. A bad harvest meant starvation. A harsh winter meant death. There was no grocery store, no furnace, no hospital. You lived or died by your ability to work with nature, not against it. And so they watched. They noticed. They built their entire calendar around what mattered most. Light and dark, growth and death, warmth and cold. Let's break down 3 essential pieces of Celtic life that shaped everything else. Their relationship with time, their tribal structure, and their spiritual worldview. First, time itself. We think of time as a straight line. January to December, birth to death, past to future. The Celts saw it differently. Time was a wheel, always turning, always returning. The year split into 2 great halves. The light half began at Beltane, around the 1st of May, when warmth returned and crops could grow. The dark half began at Samhain, around the end of October, when cold descended and the earth went dormant. This wasn't just a calendar trick. It reflected reality. In the light half, you worked, you planted, you raised animals, you built, you traveled. In the dark half, you endured, you rationed food, you stayed close to the fire, you told stories, you remembered the dead. 4 major festivals marked the turning points. Imbolc in early February signaled the first stirrings of spring, when ewes gave birth and light began to return. Beltane in May celebrated fertility, the explosion of life, the opening of summer. Lugnasad in August honored the grain harvest, the first fruits of all that labor. And Samhain in late October closed the circle, marking the end of harvest and the beginning of winter's trial. Each festival was both practical and sacred. You weren't just celebrating a date. You were acknowledging a shift in the cosmic order, a change in the relationship between your world and the forces that sustained or threatened you. Now consider their social structure. Celtic society was tribal, not centralized. Each tribe had its own territory, its own leaders, its own identity. A king or chieftain ruled, but not with absolute power. Druids, poets, and craftsmen held their own authority. Warriors earned status through bravery. Farmers, herders, and laborers formed the foundation. Everyone had a role. Everyone knew their place. But here's what mattered. The tribe was everything. Your identity came from your people, your ancestors, your land. When you died, you didn't vanish. You joined the ancestors who still watched over the living, still influenced events, still deserve honor and remembrance. This brings us to the third piece, their spiritual worldview. The Celts didn't separate the sacred from the everyday. Gods walked among them. Spirits inhabited rivers, trees, hills. The other world, a realm of deities and the dead, existed alongside the mortal world, sometimes close enough to touch. Certain places were thin, liminal, where the barrier between worlds grew weak. Certain times were dangerous, charged with supernatural energy. Samhain was the thinnest time of all. They believed in gods tied to the land, to war, to crafts, to fertility. But they also believed in something we might call fate or cosmic order. The Druids, their learned class, claimed to understand this order, to read signs, to communicate with the divine. This wasn't superstition to them. It was survival. If you angered the gods, your crops failed. If you failed to honor the dead, they might return to harm you. If you ignored omens, you walked into disaster. Here's where it all connects. Imagine a Celtic farmer in late October. The harvest is gathered, or it isn't. Either way, it's over. Winter is coming. He looks at his stores of grain and dried meat and wonders, will it be enough? He thinks of relatives who died last year, whose bodies returned to the earth but whose spirits he believes are still present. He knows that on Samhain night, the veil between his world and theirs will dissolve. The dead will walk. Other things, darker things, might cross over too. This isn't abstract philosophy. It's the framework of his entire existence. He doesn't go to work and come home and forget about spirituality until Sunday. Every action, every decision, every moment is woven into this understanding of how the world works. When he lights a fire on Samhain, he's not just trying to stay warm. He's participating in a cosmic act of protection and renewal. When he wears a mask, he's not playing dress up. He's trying to survive the night. The Celtic worldview was holistic. The practical and the sacred were one. You couldn't separate farming from ritual any more than you could separate eating from breathing. This is why Samhain mattered so intensely. It wasn't a holiday. It was the hinge point of the year, the moment when everything hung in the balance. The harvest determined if you lived or died over winter. The spirits determined if you were protected or cursed. The rituals determined if you maintained your connection to the forces that sustained your world. And here's the ripple effect. Because time was cyclical, because the tribe was everything, because the spiritual world was real and present, every Samhain wasn't just a repetition, it was a renewal. You weren't celebrating the same festival your grandfather celebrated. You were participating in the eternal return, the same cosmic moment that had existed since the beginning and would exist until the end. Your grandfather's spirit might be present tonight. Your great-great-grandchildren would stand on this same ground, light this same fire, speak these same words. Past, present, and future collapsed into one charged moment. This is what made the Celts different from many ancient peoples. They didn't build pyramids or write epics or conquer empires. They built a way of seeing that empire survived. They created a relationship with death, with darkness, with the unknown that was neither denial nor despair. They looked at the ending of the year, the coming of winter, the presence of death, and said, "This is sacred too. This is part of the wheel. We honor it. We protect ourselves. We remember." So when you think of Samhain, don't think of a primitive festival that we've outgrown. Think of it as the fruit of a worldview, that took seriously what we often ignore. Endings matter, ancestors matter. Darkness is not evil, but essential. Death is not the opposite of life, but part of its rhythm. That framework, that Celtic understanding of time and spirit and community, is what made Samhain possible. Without it, the festival would have been just another autumn party. With it, Samhain became something that could survive the fall of Celtic civilization itself, adapt to new contexts, and eventually transform into the Halloween you know today. Next, we need to look at what Samhain actually meant to these people, what they believed was happening on that liminal night when the world turned from light to dark. You've probably heard that Halloween is connected to the dead. But do you know why? Not just as trivia, but as something that makes emotional sense, something that served a real purpose for real people facing real fears. Understanding what Samhain meant to the Celts will change how you see every October tradition, from the costumes to the candy to the ghost stories. It will show you that what seems like fun and games has roots in something much deeper, a sophisticated way of dealing with mortality, loss, and the unknown. Samhain fell on the night of October 31st into November 1st, but calling it a date misses the point. It was a threshold, a doorway, a moment when the normal rules didn't apply. The Celts believed that on this night, the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead became thin, permeable, almost non-existent. The dead could cross over, and so could other things. Think about what that meant emotionally. Your mother died last winter. Your child died in the spring. Your brother died in a raid last summer. They're gone. But on Samhain night, they might return, not as zombies or monsters, but as themselves, the people you loved, still connected to you, still part of the family. You could honor them, feed them, speak to them. For one night, the separation wasn't absolute. Death wasn't the final word. But here's the tension. Not everything that crossed over was friendly. The veil worked both ways. Malevolent spirits, dangerous entities from the other world, creatures that meant harm, they could cross too. So Samhain was both reunion and risk. You wanted your ancestors close, but you needed protection from everything else. This is why the rituals mattered so much. They weren't about fun. They were about survival in a spiritual sense. Let's explore 3 dimensions of what Samhain meant. Its role as a liminal time, its connection to endings, and its transformation of how death was understood. First, liminality. This is a fancy word for in-betweenness. A doorway is liminal. Dawn and dusk are liminal. Adolescence is liminal. You're not one thing or the other. You're transitioning. And in that transition, strange things become possible. Samhain was the most liminal moment in the Celtic year. The harvest was over, but winter hadn't fully arrived. The year was ending, but the new year hadn't begun. The dead were gone, but on this night they returned. Everything was in flux, in motion, in between. Why does liminality matter? Because when boundaries dissolve, so do certainties. The rules that govern normal time don't apply. This creates danger, yes, but also opportunity. You could divine the future on Samhain. You could communicate with spirits. You could perform rituals that wouldn't work at other times. The veil being thin wasn't just a threat. It was access to knowledge and power usually hidden from mortals. Consider a young woman wondering who she'll marry. On an ordinary day, there's no way to know. But on Samhain night, She might perform a ritual involving a mirror, an apple, a candle, and see a face. True or not, the belief was real. The liminal moment made it possible. Or consider a farmer worried about next year's crop. On Samhain, he might read signs, the behavior of animals, the pattern of flames, the dreams that came after the feast. The thinness of the veil gave him access to information from the other side. Now let's look at endings. Samhain marked the end of everything that defined the light half of the year. The harvest was complete. Whatever you'd grown, gathered, or stored was all you had. There was no more gathering. The earth was shutting down. Animals were slaughtered for winter, meat. The surplus was gone. You lived now on what you'd put away. This created a natural moment for accounting. Did you do enough? Do you have enough? Will you survive? But it wasn't just practical endings. The year itself was ending. In the Celtic calendar, Samhain wasn't the end of October. It was New Year's Eve. The next day, November 1st, was the first day of the new year. So Samhain was the last gasp of the dying year, the final night before everything reset. This made it both an ending and a beginning, death and birth in one moment. The dying year had to be honored, released, sent off properly. Otherwise, how could the new year come cleanly? This is where the association with death becomes clear. Samhain wasn't morbid, it was realistic. Life has a rhythm: growth, peak, decline, death, and then rebirth. The Celts didn't fear this cycle. They respected it. Death wasn't evil. It was necessary. Without winter, there's no spring. Without endings, there are no beginnings. Samhain acknowledged that. It said, yes, things die. Yes, darkness comes. Yes, we will all cross over eventually. And that's okay. That's the way of things. This brings us to the third dimension, how Samhain transformed death itself. In many cultures, death is the enemy, something to deny, fight, avoid at all costs. The Celts took a different approach. Death was powerful, mysterious, even sacred, but not evil. The dead weren't gone. They were in the other world, a place not of punishment or nothingness, but of continuation. And on Samhain, the living and the dead could interact. This changed everything. If your ancestors could return, you needed to welcome them. You set a place at the table for them. You left food outside your door. You spoke their names. You told their stories. This wasn't creepy or morbid. It was a connection. It was saying, you're still part of us. We haven't forgotten. You still matter. The dead, in turn, were believed to offer protection, guidance, wisdom. They watched over their descendants. They wanted the family to thrive. Honoring them on Samhain strengthened that bond. But not all dead were friendly. This is important. The Celts distinguished between ancestors and other spirits. Your grandfather's ghost was welcome. A malevolent entity from the other world was not. A spirit with a grudge was not. An angry fey creature was not. So you needed to be careful. You needed protection. You needed to show respect to the good spirits while warding off the bad ones. This is where many Samhain rituals came from. The bonfires, the masks, the offerings. They were tools for navigation in a dangerous spiritual landscape. Think about how this created a psychology around death. You weren't in denial. You weren't pretending that death didn't exist, or that your loved ones were gone forever. You were maintaining a relationship with them. You were keeping them alive in memory and ritual. This is actually profoundly healthy. Modern psychology tells us that remembering the dead, speaking about them, integrating them into ongoing life is healthier than pretending they never existed. The Celts understood this instinctively 2,000 years ago. And here's the ripple effect. Because Samhain made death visible, made it part of the communal experience, it prevented death from becoming taboo. Children grew up seeing death honored, not hidden. Grief was shared, not privatized. The mystery of what happens after death wasn't answered with false certainty, but with a framework. They go to the other world. They're still with us in some way. We'll see them again, either on the next Samhain or when we die ourselves. This framework gave people a way to live with uncertainty without being paralyzed by it. Consider a mother who lost a child. Devastating then as now. But on Samhain, she could set a bowl of milk outside for that child's spirit. She could tell stories about the child to the family gathered around the fire. She could feel, for one night, that the child was close. Was this objectively true? We can't know. But it was psychologically true. It gave her grief a place to go, a form to take, a ritual to express it. And it connected her grief to the community's larger experience with loss and memory. This is why Samhain wasn't a morbid festival. It was cathartic. It acknowledged what's true. We die. We lose people we love. Life is fragile and limited. But it also said, and that's okay. We have ways to deal with this. We have rituals. We have a community. We have connections to those who came before and those who will come after. Death is part of the story, not the end of it. The legends told on Samhain night reinforce this. Stories of spirits walking the roads, appearing at crossroads, visiting old homes. Stories of heroes who travelled to the other world and returned. Stories of gods who died and were reborn. These weren't just entertainment. They were teaching tools. They said, here's how the world works, here's what's possible, here's what to watch for, here's how to respond. The stories kept the knowledge alive when writing didn't exist. So what did Samhain mean? It meant acknowledging the darkest truths and finding a way to live with them. It meant maintaining connection across the ultimate boundary. It meant respecting death without being destroyed by it. It meant community, memory, and continuity in the face of loss. And it meant that one night a year, the barrier between here and there, now and then, living and dead, could be thin enough to touch. That meaning is why Samhain survived. You can conquer a people, destroy their temples, kill their priests, but you can't destroy a meaning that meets a fundamental human need. We need ways to deal with death. We need rituals for loss. We need connection to what came before. Samhain offered all of that. And when the festival transformed over centuries into Halloween, it carried that core meaning forward. Even when most people forgot why they were doing what they were doing. Next, we need to explore the actual practices of Samhain, starting with the most important. Not food. You can go weeks without food. Not water, though you'll die in days. Fire. In the cold months, fire is life itself. The Celts knew this bone deep. And on Samhain, fire became more than a tool. It became a spiritual technology, a bridge between worlds, a weapon against darkness, and a promise of survival. Understanding the role of fire in Samhain will show you why bonfires still matter, why candles in jack-o'-lanterns still glow, and why light and darkness play such a central role in every Halloween tradition. Picture a Celtic village on Samhain night. Darkness has fallen early. The cold is coming. Inside homes, the hearth fires that have burned all year are deliberately extinguished. Imagine that, your only source of heat and light, the center of your home, intentionally put out. The house goes dark. The family feels the cold immediately. Outside, the entire community gathers on a hilltop. They've built a massive bonfire, not the little camping fire you might make, but a towering inferno of wood and brush and sacred plants. The druids light it with ceremony. The flames leap into the sky. And suddenly, in that ring of firelight, the community is together, warm, protected, alive. This wasn't entertainment. This was the axis around which Samhain turned. Let's break down the role of fire into 3 functions: protection, purification, and renewal. First, protection. Why did the Celts need protection? Because on Samhain night, when the veil between worlds was thin, dangerous spirits could cross over. Malevolent entities, angry ghosts, fey creatures with their own agendas. All of them were abroad in the darkness. Fire was the first line of defense. Spirits, in Celtic belief, couldn't cross fire. It formed a barrier they couldn't breach. So the bonfire created a circle of safety. Inside that circle, the community was protected. Outside that circle was the unknown, the wild, the dangerous. But fire's protection went deeper than just a barrier. Fire represented the sun, the source of all life and light. During the dark half of the year, the sun weakened. Days grew shorter. Warmth faded. The bonfire was, in a sense, capturing the sun's power and holding it on earth. It was a way of saying, even in the darkest time, we keep the light alive. We refuse to surrender completely to winter. We maintain a connection to the life-giving force that will return in spring. Consider the psychological impact. You're standing in the dark, cold October night. The year is dying. Winter is coming. Death is all around, both literally and symbolically. Then you see the fire. Massive, bright, warm. It pushes back the darkness. It warms your body. It makes you feel safe. This isn't superstition. This is a fundamental human response. We evolved around fire. It's coded into us. Fire means safety, warmth, food, community, life. The Samhain bonfire activated all of those associations at the exact moment when people most needed reassurance. Now let's look at purification. Fire cleanses. It burns away corruption, disease, and impurity. The Celts understood this practically and spiritually. After the harvest, before winter, they needed to ensure that everything they depended on was clean, protected, blessed. So they performed fire rituals. The most important involved their cattle, their most valuable possessions. They would herd the cattle between 2 bonfires, driving them through the narrow passage. The smoke, the heat, the sacred flames would purify the animals, protect them from disease, and ensure they survived the winter. This wasn't magical thinking in the way we use that term dismissively. Disease was real. Cattle plague could wipe out a herd and doom a family to starvation. Any practice that seemed to protect the herd was valuable, but it was also deeply symbolic. The cattle passing between fires mirrored the community passing through Samhain itself. You were moving from one state to another, from the old year to the new, from the light half to the dark half. The fire marked that transition, cleansed you for it, prepared you. The ashes from the bonfire were sacred. After the fire burned down, people would gather the ashes and spread them on their fields. This wasn't random. Ashes are rich in minerals. They do help soil. But more than that, they carried the blessing of the fire, the protection of the ritual, the prayers of the druids. They were a physical link between the sacred ceremony and the practical work of farming. Your field, blessed with Samhain ashes, would be protected, would yield better, would connect you to the cycle of renewal that the fire represented. This brings us to the third function, renewal. Remember, Samhain marked the end of the old year and the beginning of the new. Fire is the ultimate symbol of destruction and creation. It destroys what it touches, reduces it to ash. But from ash comes new growth. Forest fires clear dead wood and allow new trees to sprout. The Celts saw this. They understood fire as both ending and beginning. The extinguishing of hearth fires before Samhain and the relighting of them from the communal bonfire enacted this renewal. Your old fire, the one that burned all year, dies. In the darkness, you wait. Then you walk to the communal fire, the sacred fire blessed by the Druids. You carry home an ember carefully protected, and from that ember you relight your hearth. Your home has new fire now, clean fire, blessed fire. Fire that connects you to the community and to the sacred powers invoked on Samhain. Think about what this ritual created. Everyone's hearth fire came from the same source. You weren't isolated. Your home was connected to every other home through fire. If your neighbor's fire went out, they could come to you for an ember, because all the fires are related. All came from the same sacred source. This is social technology. This is how you bind the community together. Shared fire means shared life means shared fate. And here's the ripple effect. Because fire was central to Samhain, and because Samhain marked the transition into winter, fire became associated with survival through darkness. Every time you lit your hearth on a cold winter night, you were, in a small way, reenacting Samhain. You were keeping the light alive. You were maintaining the connection to that communal moment when the entire tribe gathered and said, "We survived together." Consider the emotional weight of carrying fire home from the Samhain bonfire. You're walking through the dark with your ember carefully protected. If it goes out before you reach home, you have to go back. But if you keep it alive, you're bringing the sacred fire, the protected fire, the blessed fire into your home. You're literally carrying life in your hands. This isn't abstract symbolism. This is an embodied ritual. Your body, your breath, your careful steps, your relief when the ember catches in your hearth. All of it reinforces the meaning. Fire also served as the focal point for the community gathering. Standing around the bonfire, people weren't just warming themselves. They were seeing each other's faces in the flickering light. They were telling stories. They were singing. They were sharing food. They were reinforcing bonds. In the winter months ahead, you might not see some of these people until spring. The Samhain bonfire was your chance to connect, to remember who you were as a tribe, to feel part of something larger than your individual struggle. The Druids used fire for divination. They would read the flames, interpret how the fire burned, watch the smoke, throw sacred herbs into the fire, and observe the results. This gave fire a prophetic quality. It wasn't just protection or purification. It was communication. The fire could speak if you knew how to listen. It could reveal what the coming year held. It could show omens, warnings, promises. This made fire a mediator between humans and the divine, a translator of messages from the other world. There's also a practical dimension we shouldn't ignore. Late October in Ireland or Scotland is cold, damp, dark. A bonfire is genuinely wonderful. It feels amazing to stand near one. Your face gets hot while your back stays cold. The smoke gets in your eyes. The heat makes you drowsy. The light dances and plays. This sensory experience reinforced the ritual meaning. The bonfire wasn't just a symbol. It was a real, physical experience that your body remembered. Year after year, you'd return to that hilltop, stand in that heat, smell that smoke, and the memories would layer on memories, connecting you to every Samhain that came before. Fire's role in Samhain is why candles in jack-o'-lanterns still matter. We've lost most of the ritual framework, but we still light a candle and put it in a carved pumpkin and set it outside on Halloween night. We're still using fire to mark the threshold of our homes, to create a point of light in the darkness, to participate in something that feels ancient even if we don't know why. That's the power of fire. It survives cultural changes because it speaks to something deeper than culture. So when you see a bonfire at a Halloween party, when you light a candle in your pumpkin, when you gather around any fire in late October, you're participating in something that reaches back thousands of years. Fire as protection, fire as purification, fire as renewal, fire as the link between the human and the divine, the living and the dead, the old year and the new. The Celts understood fire's power, and they built their most important festival around it. Next, we need to talk about the people who controlled the fire, who guided the rituals, who stood between the community and the other world, the Druids. They weren't just priests. They were teachers, judges, advisors, healers, historians, poets, and prophets. They could make or break a king. They could bless or curse a harvest. They could determine the fate of an individual or an entire tribe. Understanding the Druids and their role in Samhain shows you how religion and power intertwined, how knowledge was controlled, and how a festival became a tool for maintaining social order in a world without writing or centralized government. First, let's be clear about what Druids were. They formed a learned class that stood somewhat apart from normal society. To become a Druid required years of training, sometimes as many as 20 years. During that time, you memorized vast amounts of information. Genealogies, laws, stories, rituals, herbal knowledge, astronomical observations, poetry. All of this without writing it down. This created an exclusive body of knowledge that only Druids possessed. They were essentially the memory and conscience of Celtic society. Let's explore three aspects of Druidic power: their role as ritual leaders, their function as advisors and judges, and their controversial practice of sacrifice. First, ritual leadership. Samhain couldn't happen without Druids. They knew the proper prayers, the proper timing, the proper procedures. When the community gathered for the bonfire, it was a Druid who lit it. When animals were slaughtered, it was a Druid who blessed them. When omens were read, it was a Druid who interpreted them. This gave Druids immense power. If you angered a Druid, they could refuse to perform the rituals. Without the rituals, you had no protection from malevolent spirits, no blessing for your crops, no connection to the divine. The community needed them. But Druidic power wasn't just about controlling ritual. It was about controlling meaning. Anyone can light a fire, but only a Druid could light it in the way that made it sacred. Only a Druid could speak the words that turned ordinary flame into protective fire. Only a Druid could connect the fire to the gods, to the ancestors, to the cosmic order. This is symbolic power, the ability to determine what things mean. And symbolic power is real power. Consider what this meant during Samhain. The Druids stood between the community and the most dangerous night of the year. They were the guides, the protectors, the ones who knew how to navigate the thinning of the veil. If a spirit appeared, a druid would know what it wanted, how to appease it, how to drive it away. If something went wrong, a druid could fix it. This created a relationship of dependency. The community needed druids, especially on Samhain when the stakes were highest. Now let's look at their role as advisors and judges. Druids didn't just lead rituals. They advised kings and chieftains on matters of war, law, and governance. A king might have military power, but a druid had moral and spiritual authority. If a druid said an action would anger the gods, the king had to listen. If a druid declared a law unjust, it could undermine the king's legitimacy. Druids could, in some cases, remove a king who violated sacred principles. This created a system of checks and balances, a way to limit royal power without a written constitution. During Samhain, this advisory role became crucial. Druids would perform divinations to determine what the coming year held. They would read signs, the pattern of bird flights, the behavior of sacrificed animals, the shapes in the bonfire smoke, the dreams reported by community members. Based on these signs, they would give advice. Plant this crop, not that one. Raid this neighbor in spring. Move to new pastures. These weren't casual suggestions. They were prophecies backed by sacred authority. A community that ignored druidic advice did so at its peril. Druids also served as judges. Celtic society had complex laws regarding property, honor, marriage, crime. Without writing, these laws existed in memory, in precedent, in the knowledge that druids held. When disputes arose, druids would arbitrate. They would recall similar cases, apply traditional law, render judgment. Their decisions were binding because they carried the weight of tradition and the threat of spiritual consequences. If you defied a druid's judgment, you could be cursed, ostracized, or declared outside the tribe's protection. This brings us to the controversial topic, sacrifice. Did druids perform human sacrifice? Ancient Roman writers claim they did. They described wicker men, giant figures woven from branches, filled with human victims and burned alive. They described criminals or war captives, or even volunteers being killed as offerings to the gods. How much of this is true, and how much is Roman propaganda designed to justify conquest, is still debated. What we know for certain: druids definitely sacrificed animals during Samhain and other festivals. Cattle, sheep, pigs were ritually slaughtered. The meat fed the community feast. But the killing was more than practical. It was offering. You gave the gods something valuable, something that cost you to maintain the relationship between divine and human. The blood, the flesh, the smoke of burning fat, all pleased the gods and ensured their protection. Did they sacrifice humans? Possibly. Some Celtic societies, some of the time, might have practiced human sacrifice in extreme circumstances. Drought, plague, existential threat. When the stakes were highest, the offering had to match. But this wasn't casual or common. If it happened at all, it was rare, controlled, and deeply ritualized. The victims were likely criminals already sentenced to death, or captives taken in war, or in some cases, volunteers who believed their death would save the community. Why does this matter for understanding Samhain? Because sacrifice, animal or human, reinforced the druids' position as the only ones who could properly communicate with the gods. Killing is dangerous, both practically and spiritually. It requires knowledge to do it correctly, to make it sacred rather than just violence. Druids held that knowledge. They knew which animals to kill, how to kill them, what prayers to say, how to read the organs afterward for omens. This specialized knowledge made them indispensable. Consider the psychology of watching a druid perform a sacrifice during Samhain. The community gathers. A druid in ceremonial robes steps forward. An animal is brought out. Prayers are chanted. The knife comes down. Blood flows. The animal is butchered efficiently. Parts are offered to the fire. Other parts are prepared for the feast. This isn't horror. This is controlled, purposeful, meaningful. The druid has taken something alive and transformed it into something sacred. The community has participated in a transaction with the gods. And here's the ripple effect. Because druids controlled access to the sacred, they controlled the framework through which people understood events. Good harvest. The druids blessed it properly. Bad harvest. Someone violated a taboo. Sickness in the village. The gods are angry. Recovery. The rituals worked. This is circular reasoning, yes, but it's also a complete explanatory system. Everything that happened could be fit into the framework that druids maintained. This gave people a sense of control in an unpredictable world. You couldn't control the weather, but you could perform the right rituals. You couldn't see the future, but druids could read signs. There's another dimension to druidic power. Fear. Druids could curse. They could declare someone outside the tribe's protection. They could predict doom. This wasn't an empty threat. In a society where communal belonging was everything, where survival depended on cooperation, being cursed or ostracized was devastating. Druids wielded this power carefully, because using it too often would undermine their authority. But the threat was always there. Cross a druid, and you risked not just divine anger, but social death. During Samhain, when the veil was thin and spirits walked, druidic power peaked. This was their night. They knew the prayers that would protect you. They knew the rituals that would appease the dangerous spirits. They knew how to read the omens that would guide you through the coming year. Without them, you faced the darkness alone. With them, you had guidance, protection, and hope. This asymmetry of knowledge created a dependency that reinforced druidic authority year after year. But we should also understand that druids weren't simply exploiting the community. Most of them likely believed deeply in what they taught. They had spent decades learning the traditions, experiencing the rituals, developing a spiritual sensitivity to the unseen world. They saw themselves as genuine intermediaries, servants of the gods, protectors of the people. Their power came with responsibility. A druid who gave bad advice, who failed to protect the community, who violated sacred principles, would lose authority. The system had accountability, even if it was informal. Contrast the druid's role during Samhain with the ordinary villager's experience. The villager participated in the rituals but didn't lead them. The villager received blessings but didn't give them. The villager hoped for protection but couldn't guarantee it. The villager lived in uncertainty. The druid, at least in appearance, lived in knowledge. This created a natural hierarchy, not based on wealth or military power, but on spiritual authority and specialized knowledge. Consider also the educational aspect. Young people who showed promise might be trained as druids. This created social mobility. A poor farmer's child with a good memory and spiritual sensitivity could rise to become a powerful druid. This kept the Druidic class from becoming totally isolated or hereditary. Fresh perspectives entered, new ideas could emerge, but the long training period, the oral tradition, the requirement to memorize so much material also meant that change happened slowly. Tradition was preserved, innovation was rare. When Christianity eventually came to Celtic lands, one of its first targets was the Druids. Why? Because the Druids held the old religion, the old knowledge, the old authority. Destroy the Druids, and you break the transmission of Celtic spiritual tradition. Without Druids, Samhain rituals could still happen, but they'd lose their authoritative interpretation. They'd become folk practices rather than organized religion. This is exactly what happened. The Druids were killed, converted, or driven into hiding. And without them, Samhain began its long transformation from a Druid-led sacred ceremony into a folk festival that eventually became Halloween. But during the height of Celtic civilization, the Druids were the axis around which Samhain turned. They lit the sacred fires. They performed the sacrifices. They read the omens. They advised the community. They maintained the connection between the living, the dead, and the divine. Their presence made Samhain not just a party or a harvest festival, but a genuine religious experience. A moment when the cosmic order was reinforced, when chaos was held at bay, when the community was bound together through shared ritual and shared belief. Understanding the Druids helps us see why Samhain was so powerful and why it could survive even after the Druids themselves disappeared. The rituals they created, the meanings they established, the practices they led became so deeply embedded in Celtic culture that even without religious authorities to enforce them, people kept doing them. The rituals moved from sacred ceremony to tradition to folk custom, but the thread remained unbroken. Next, we need to look at one of the most visible and lasting Samhain practices, something that still defines Halloween today: the wearing of costumes and masks. Why do we dress up on Halloween? If you ask most people, they'll shrug and say it's just for fun. And it is fun, but that fun has roots in something deadly serious. The Celtic belief that on Samhain night, when dangerous spirits walked the earth, you needed to hide who you were or become something else entirely. Understanding the origins of costuming during Samhain reveals a fascinating truth. What we do for entertainment was once done for survival, and the psychology behind it, the deep human need to transform, to play with identity, to become other than ourselves, that's still operating today even if we've forgotten why. Picture a Celtic villager preparing for Samhain night. The sun is setting. The veil between worlds is thinning. Spirits are crossing over. Some are ancestors, welcome guests, but others are dangerous, malevolent, looking for mischief or worse. How do you protect yourself? Fire helps, ritual helps, but what if you have to leave the safety of the bonfire circle? What if you have to walk home alone in the dark? You need another strategy. You need disguise. Let's break down the practice of masking and costuming into 3 motivations: confusion, transformation, and imitation. First, confusion. The simplest reason for wearing a disguise on Samhain was to confuse the spirits. If a malevolent entity was looking for victims, it would target humans. But if you didn't look human, if you wore animal skins and antlers and covered your face with ash or a carved wooden mask, the spirit might pass you by. You'd blend into the darkness. You'd look like something else, something not worth bothering. This was protective camouflage, spiritual rather than physical. Think about what this required. You couldn't just throw on any old clothes. The disguise had to be convincing, at least convincing enough to create doubt in the spirit's mind. So people used what they had. Animal pelts from the butchered livestock, antlers from deer hunted earlier in the year, grotesque masks carved from wood or fashioned from leather. They'd smear their faces with ash from the hearth. They'd move differently, adopting animalistic postures and gaits. The goal was to stop looking like yourself. This practice created an interesting psychological effect. When you put on a mask, you feel different. Your inhibitions change. You can act in ways you normally wouldn't, because you're not quite yourself anymore. The mask creates distance between your everyday identity and your actions. The Celts understood this instinctively. On Samhain night, when normal rules didn't apply, when the world was turned upside down, becoming someone or something else wasn't just protective, it was liberating. Now consider transformation. Masks and costumes weren't just about hiding, they were about becoming. In Celtic belief, the boundary between human and animal, between one form and another, was not absolute. Shape-shifting appeared in many of their stories. Gods took animal form. Heroes transformed. Druids could supposedly change their appearance. During Samhain, when all boundaries weakened, transformation became possible for ordinary people too. Not literal transformation, but ritual transformation. When you put on the skin of a stag and antlers on your head, you took on some quality of the stag, its swiftness, its wildness, its connection to the forest. When you wore a wolf pelt, you borrowed wolf's ferocity and cunning. This wasn't play acting, it was sympathetic magic, the belief that resemblance creates connection. By looking like the animal, you gained access to its power. This made you more formidable, better able to navigate the dangerous night. There's also evidence that some people dressed as the spirits themselves. They would make themselves look like the dead, like ghosts, like creatures from the other world. Why? Several possible reasons. First, it reinforced the confusion strategy. If spirits saw what they thought was one of their own, they'd leave you alone. Second, it allowed the living to act out the role of the dead, to embody that transition, to explore what death meant. Third, it created a controlled way to acknowledge the presence of spirits without being victimized by them. You weren't just hiding from the dead, you were performing death. This brings us to imitation. Some people during Samhain would dress up and go from house to house, performing, singing, reciting poetry, offering blessings in exchange for food or drink. This practice, called guising, is a direct ancestor of trick-or-treating, but it wasn't children's entertainment. It was adults performing a ritual function. By dressing in disguise and moving through the community, they were imitating the spirits who walked on Samhain night. They were enacting what everyone believed was happening in the invisible realm. When a disguised figure appeared at your door, you had a moment of uncertainty. Is this my neighbor in a costume? Or is this an actual spirit? That uncertainty was intentional. It created a liminal experience for both the disguised person and the householder. The householder would offer food and drink, not just to their neighbor, but symbolically to the spirits themselves. The disguised person would offer blessings or entertainment in return. This exchange reinforced community bonds, while also fulfilling ritual obligations to the unseen world. Think about the social dimension of this. If you lived in a small village, you knew everyone. You knew their voices, their builds, their mannerisms. A truly effective disguise had to obscure all of that. This required skill. The best disguises became objects of admiration. Young people would compete to create the most convincing transformations. This created a tradition of craftsmanship around costume making that's still visible today in the elaborate Halloween costumes people create. And here's the ripple effect. Once you establish the tradition that Samhain is a night when you can become someone else, when you can hide your identity, when normal social rules are suspended, you create space for all kinds of behavior. Pranks could be played, grievances could be aired anonymously, social hierarchies could be temporarily inverted. A poor farmer could dress as a king. A young person could mock an elder. Things could be said and done that would be unthinkable on ordinary days. This wasn't chaos. It was controlled chaos, a pressure valve for a society that normally had strict rules and clear hierarchies. One night a year, those rules relaxed. People could play, could experiment with identity, could do things they'd never do under their own names. Then morning came, the masks came off, and normal life resumed. But everyone had experienced a moment of freedom, of possibility, of transformation. Consider the psychological comfort this provided. Living in Celtic society meant your identity was mostly fixed. You were born into a status. Your role in the tribe was clear. Your future was predictable. But on Samhain night, you could be anything. This fed a deep human need for novelty, for play, for exploring other possibilities. Even if it was only for one night, even if it was only ritual, it mattered. The grotesqueness of many Samhain masks and costumes also served a purpose. Beauty wasn't the goal. The goal was to be unsettling, strange, other. The masks had exaggerated features, twisted expressions, inhuman qualities. Why? Because the spirits that walked on Samhain night weren't human. They came from the other world, a place with different rules. Making yourself grotesque was making yourself fit for that world, making yourself part of that landscape rather than standing out as prey. There was also likely an element of emotional release. Fear is exhausting. The build-up to Samhain, the awareness that the dangerous night was approaching, created tension. Putting on a mask, becoming something fearsome yourself, allowed you to flip the script. Instead of being afraid, you became the thing that's frightening. This is why children still love dressing as monsters and ghosts. It's empowering to embody what scares you. The practice of guising also served an educational function. Children learned the old stories by watching the disguised adults perform them. They learned which spirits were dangerous and which were benign. They learned how to interact with the supernatural, how to offer respect, how to protect themselves. The costumes and masks weren't just fun. They were teaching tools, ways to pass on essential cultural knowledge in a society without books. When Christianity began to suppress Samhain traditions, one of the things that survived most stubbornly was the costuming. Priests could forbid bonfires. They could replace the Feast of the Dead with their own holy days. But they couldn't stop people from dressing up. The practice was too fun, too deeply embedded, too psychologically satisfying. So it continued, slowly losing its spiritual significance, slowly becoming more about play than protection, but never dying out. By the time Samhain traditions crossed the Atlantic to America with Irish and Scottish immigrants, The costumes had already become more playful than serious, but the basic pattern remained. On this night, you can become someone else. On this night, the mask you wear changes how you feel and how others see you. On this night, transformation is possible. That core idea, born in Celtic fears about dangerous spirits, survives in every child who puts on a costume and becomes, for a few hours, something other than themselves. The Celts who first wore grotesque masks on Samhain night would probably be baffled by modern Halloween costumes. Superheroes and princesses and movie characters aren't about confusing malevolent spirits, but they'd recognize the impulse, the desire to transform, to try on a different identity, to experience yourself as something other than what you are every other day of the year. That impulse is human, universal, and timeless. The Celts just gave it form and purpose. Next, we need to explore another practice that survived the centuries, the feast, and the particular way the Celts included the dead in their celebration. Food is love. Food is memory. Food is connection. Every culture knows this, but the Celts took it a step further. Food was also the bridge between the living and the dead. The Samhain feast wasn't just a meal. It was a ritual that gathered the community, honored the ancestors, appeased dangerous spirits, and celebrated survival in the face of winter's approach. Understanding how food functioned during Samhain reveals something profound about how humans deal with loss, how we maintain relationships across death's boundary, and why we still gather for meals during the darkest times. The Samhain feast happened after the bonfire rituals, after the cattle had been herded between the flames, after the omens had been read. The community would gather, often in the chieftain's hall or a communal space, and the eating would begin. But this wasn't just about filling stomachs. Let's explore 3 dimensions of the feast: celebration, remembrance, and appeasement. First, celebration. The harvest was complete. You'd worked all summer, toiling in fields, tending animals, gathering, storing. Now the work was done. Whatever you'd managed to put away was what you had. This created a natural moment for celebration. You'd survived another year. You'd beaten starvation one more time. This deserved acknowledgement. The feast said, "Look what we accomplished. Look what we have. We made it." The food at Samhain feast reflected the harvest. Freshly slaughtered meat, because you couldn't keep all the animals through winter and needed to cull the herd. Bread made from newly threshed grain. Apples, the last fruit of the year. Ale and mead fermented from the summer's yield. Nuts gathered from the forest. Root vegetables pulled from the earth. Everything on the table represented months of labor, the accumulated wealth of the tribe, the tangible proof of their success. Think about what it felt like to sit at that table. The hall is warm, the fire blazes. Your belly, empty so often during the lean times, is full. Your neighbors surround you. The air smells of roasted meat and fresh bread. There's laughter. There are songs. For this moment, winter's threat feels distant. For this moment, you're not struggling, you're thriving. The feast creates a memory of abundance that will sustain you through the months of scarcity ahead. But Samhain feasts weren't just about the living. This is where it gets interesting. The Celts set extra places at the table, empty seats, plates with food that no one would eat, cups filled with drink that no one would touch. These were for the dead, for their ancestors who had passed but were believed to return on Samhain night. The empty chair honored your grandfather who died last winter. The untouched plate acknowledged your aunt who died in childbirth. The full cup remembered your brother who died in battle. This practice created a powerful psychological and emotional effect. Death had not severed the relationship. The dead were still family. They still belonged at the table. Their absence was physical, but their presence was spiritual. You could imagine them there, participating, watching, perhaps even somehow partaking of the feast in a way invisible to mortal eyes. This transformed grief into connection. Yes, they were gone, but not completely, not tonight. Consider a mother who lost a child. The grief is overwhelming, but on Samhain night, she sets a place for that child. She puts food on the plate. She speaks the child's name. She tells stories about the child to the gathered family. The child is remembered, honored, included. This doesn't erase the grief, but it gives the grief form, purpose, place. It says, you mattered. You still matter. We haven't forgotten. This brings us to the second dimension, remembrance. The Samhain feast was when stories about the dead were told. Genealogies were recited. Deeds were remembered. The recently dead were mourned. Communally, the long dead were celebrated. In a culture without writing, this oral remembrance was how history survived. The feast became an archive, a living library of who came before. Someone would stand and speak about their grandfather, a warrior who fought in a great battle 30 years ago. Someone else would recall a healer who saved many lives during a plague. A druid might recite the genealogy of the chieftain's line, going back generations, connecting the living leader to ancestral chiefs who gave the family legitimacy. Young people heard these stories and absorbed them, learning who they came from, what their people valued, what legacy they were part of. This served multiple functions. It educated, it entertained, it reinforced tribal identity, it provided moral examples, it connected past, present, and future. When you heard about your great-great-grandmother's courage during a famine, you understood that courage ran in your blood. You had something to live up to. You were part of a story larger than yourself. But the feast also looked forward. Toasts were made not just to the dead, but to the future, to the children who would be born next year, to the crops that would be planted in spring, to victories hoped for, to marriages planned. The feast existed in the liminal space of Samhain itself, acknowledging endings while anticipating beginnings. Now let's look at the third dimension, appeasement. Not all spirits who walked on Samhain night were friendly ancestors. Some were dangerous, capricious, potentially harmful. These spirits needed to be managed. One way to manage them was through offering. Food and drink were left outside homes, at crossroads, at the boundaries of the village. These offerings said, "We respect you. We acknowledge you. Here's hospitality. Please pass by without harm." This practice reveals sophisticated thinking about the supernatural. The Celts didn't just fear spirits or worship them. They negotiated with them. They understood that even dangerous entities could be reasoned with, appeased, redirected. The offering created an exchange. The spirit received something valuable. In return, it left the household alone. This was transactional spirituality, practical and effective. Think about the psychology. You're anxious about Samhain night. Malevolent spirits might harm you or your family. Setting out food and drink gives you something active to do. It's not just passive hoping. It's taking steps. You fulfilled your obligation. You've shown respect. Now you can feel more secure. The ritual reduces anxiety by providing a sense of control. The specific foods offered mattered. Milk for the fae folk who were believed to love it. Cakes or bread as valuable offerings that cost you something. Ale or mead, precious fermented drinks. Apples, sacred to the Celts and associated with the other world. These weren't random. They were carefully chosen to appeal to specific supernatural entities. And here's the ripple effect. The practice of leaving food out for spirits created a tradition of hospitality that extended beyond the supernatural. On Samhain night, a stranger arriving at your door would be fed. A traveler caught in the dark would be sheltered. Because you never knew if that stranger was actually a spirit in disguise, testing your hospitality. The safer approach was to treat everyone generously. This created a social safety net, a cultural practice that ensured no one went hungry or cold on Samhain night. The communal nature of the feast also reinforced social bonds at a critical time. Winter was coming. Resources would be scarce. Tensions might rise. But at the Samhain feast, everyone ate together. Rich and poor, powerful and weak, young and old all shared the same food, told the same stories, honored the same dead. This created unity, reminded everyone that they were one tribe, one people, dependent on each other for survival. There was also likely a practical dimension to feasting at Samhain. The meat from freshly slaughtered animals wouldn't keep long. Better to eat it now, communally, than let it spoil. The feast was a way to distribute resources, to ensure that even poorer families got meat, to create abundance before scarcity returned. This practical benefit reinforced the ritual significance. The feast worked on multiple levels simultaneously. The aftermath of the feast also mattered. Food left uneaten was sometimes buried or burned as final offerings. Nothing was wasted. Even scraps had purpose. This reflected the Celtic understanding that everything in creation was connected, that waste offended the natural order, that gratitude for abundance required using every bit of what you had. When Christianity began to transform Samhain, the feast remained, but its meaning shifted. All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day still involved communal meals, still honored the dead, but the framework changed from pagan to Christian. Yet the core practice survived. Gathering, eating, remembering, connecting across death's boundary. The Samhain feast became the All Souls feast, became the autumn harvest dinners that many families still share. Today, when you sit down for a big meal in late October or early November, when you think about people who've died, when you share stories about those who came before, you're participating in something ancient. The form has changed. The explicit spiritual framework is mostly gone, but the impulse remains. Food brings us together. Food honors those we've lost. Food reminds us that we're part of something larger than ourselves, part of a family line that stretches back and will stretch forward, part of a human story that includes both the living and the dead. The Celts understood that eating is never just about nutrition. It's about meaning. It's about relationships. It's about memory. The Samhain feast embodied all of that. It said, we survived. We remember. We share. We continue. Next, we need to look at how Samhain encountered other cultures and began the long process of transformation that would eventually lead to Halloween. Nothing stays pure forever. Cultures collide, blend, borrow from each other. Ideas travel. Practices adapt. What seems eternal in one generation becomes unrecognizable in the next. The story of Samhain's survival and transformation is the story of how a Celtic festival absorbed Roman influences, survived conquest and suppression, and managed to keep its core alive even as its surface changed. Understanding this process shows you how culture actually works, not as a museum piece preserved in amber, but as a living thing that grows, adapts, and persists through change. The turning point came in the 1st century of the Common Era. Rome, the massive empire that dominated the Mediterranean and was expanding north, conquered Celtic lands. Britain fell. Gaul, modern France, fell. The Roman legions pushed into territories that had been Celtic for centuries. They brought roads, cities, laws, and most importantly for our story, their own customs and beliefs. The Romans didn't just conquer militarily, they conquered culturally. Let's explore 3 aspects of this transformation: Roman death customs, Roman harvest festivals, and the fusion that occurred when these Roman practices met Celtic Samhain. First, Roman death customs. The Romans had their own festival for honoring the dead called Feralia. It fell in late February, not in autumn, but its purpose was similar to Samhain. During Feralia, Romans would visit the tombs of their ancestors, leave offerings of food and wine, and perform rituals to appease the spirits of the dead. They believed that neglecting the dead could lead to hauntings, that the spirits needed regular attention and honor. Sound familiar? The Romans and Celts approached death differently in many ways. Romans cremated their dead and kept elaborate tombs. Celts buried their dead or practiced excarnation, leaving bodies for the elements. Romans had written records and structured priesthoods. Celts had oral tradition and druids. But both cultures believed the dead remained present in some form. Both believed the dead needed to be honored. Both believed failure to honor the dead invited trouble. When Roman soldiers, administrators, and settlers moved into Celtic lands, they brought Feralia with them. Roman and Celtic communities lived side by side. Intermarriage happened. Cultural exchange was inevitable. A Roman man married to a Celtic woman might celebrate both Feralia and Samhain. Their children would grow up with both traditions. Over time, the 2 festivals began to influence each other, though they never fully merged during the Roman period. Now consider Pomona, the Roman goddess of fruit and orchards. The Romans held a festival in her honor around the same time as Samhain, celebrating the apple harvest and the abundance of autumn. Pomona's festival involved games, offerings of fruit, and celebrations of fertility and plenty. Apples were sacred to Pomona, and various rituals and divination practices involved apples. Here's where it gets interesting. Apples were also sacred to the Celts. They associated apples with the otherworld, with magic, with the liminal realms where gods and mortals intersected. Apples appeared in many Celtic myths. The otherworld was sometimes called the Apple Land, so when Roman Pomona worship came to Celtic lands, there was already an apple-shaped space for it to fit into. The Celtic and Roman associations with apples weren't identical, but they were compatible. This compatibility led to fusion. Celtic people began incorporating Roman apple-related practices into their Samhain celebrations. The most famous example, apple bobbing. This game, where you try to catch floating apples with your teeth, has Roman origins but became deeply associated with Samhain and eventually Halloween. Originally, it wasn't just a game. It was a form of divination. Young women would bob for apples, and the first to successfully catch one would be the first to marry. The apple, once caught, could be used in other divination rituals. Think about what this fusion created. The Roman element, apple bobbing, got grafted onto the Celtic festival, Samhain. It fit because both cultures revered apples. It worked because it was fun, social, and had the added benefit of predicting romantic futures. Within a generation or two, Celtic people probably forgot it was originally Roman. It just became part of Samhain. This is how cultural borrowing works, not as conscious theft, but as natural absorption of useful or enjoyable practices. The Romans also brought infrastructure that changed how Samhain could be celebrated. Roman roads connected communities that had been isolated. Trade increased. Ideas spread faster. A ritual practiced in one Celtic tribe could now be shared with tribes hundreds of miles away. Roman towns created gathering places where different traditions could meet and mix. The Roman occupation, for all its violence and oppression, created networks that allowed Celtic culture to spread and evolve in new ways. But here's the crucial point. Samhain survived Roman conquest. Many Celtic practices disappeared under Roman rule. Druids were suppressed. Many gods were forgotten or reimagined as Roman deities. Celtic languages began to fade in favor of Latin. Yet Samhain persisted. Why? Several reasons. First, it was deeply practical. Samhain marked a real agricultural transition. No matter who ruled, harvest ended in October. Winter came in November. The practical need to mark this transition didn't depend on maintaining political independence. Even Romanized Celts still needed to slaughter animals for winter, still needed to take stock of food supplies, still needed to prepare for the dark months ahead. Second, it was decentralized. Samhain didn't require temples or official priesthoods. It happened in villages, on hilltops, in family homes. The Romans could ban Druidic rituals, but they couldn't monitor every rural household. Families kept lighting bonfires. They kept setting places for the dead. They kept telling the old stories. The practice went underground, but never died. Third, it met deep emotional needs. The need to honor the dead, to maintain connection with ancestors, to feel part of a larger story. These don't go away because of conquest. A Celtic person living under Roman rule still had grandparents who died, still grieved, still needed rituals to process that grief. Samhain provided those rituals. The Romans had Feralia for the same purpose, which actually helped Samhain survive by giving it Roman-ish cover. And here's the ripple effect. By absorbing Roman elements while maintaining Celtic core, Samhain became more resilient, not less. It gained new practices that kept it fresh and relevant. The festival wasn't frozen in ancient purity. It was alive, adapting, taking what worked from the dominant culture and integrating it into existing patterns. This adaptability would prove crucial in centuries to come. After Rome fell in the 5th century, Celtic lands entered a complex period. In some areas, Celtic traditions roared back. In Ireland and Scotland especially, which Rome never fully controlled, Samhain continued strong. In other areas, Roman influence lingered even without Roman rule. Latin remained important. Christianity, which Rome had adopted, began spreading through Celtic lands. Yet Samhain survived this too. Rural areas especially held onto Samhain. Farmers and herders living close to the land couldn't afford to abandon practices that had worked for centuries. They might adopt Christianity, might start attending church, but they also still lit bonfires on Samhain night. They still left food for the dead. They still told the old stories. The practices became less explicitly religious, more cultural, but they persisted. This period between Roman fall and Christian dominance is when many Samhain practices solidified into the forms that would eventually cross the Atlantic. The bonfires, the costumes, the apple bobbing, the feast, the honouring of the dead. These weren't pure Celtic anymore. They were Celtic-Roman fusion, evolved over centuries, but still recognisably descended from the original festival. The survival of Samhain through Roman conquest and the post-Roman chaos proves something important about culture. The deepest practices, the ones that meet real human needs, don't die easily. You can conquer a people, change their language, impose new laws, introduce new gods, but you can't erase the need to honour the dead. You can't eliminate the need to mark the turning of seasons. You can't remove the need for communal celebration at critical moments. Samhain, by Roman contact, had become something more flexible, more adaptable, more resilient than it started as. It had learned to incorporate outside influences while maintaining its core identity. This would prove crucial when Christianity, more aggressive than Rome in suppressing pagan practices, turned its attention to Samhain. Next, we need to look at that confrontation between Samhain and the Church, and how the Church's attempts to replace Samhain ultimately transformed it but couldn't destroy it. When two worldviews collide, something has to give. The encounter between Celtic Samhain traditions and Christianity was exactly this kind of collision. On one side, a pagan festival centered on death, spirits, divination, and connection to the other world. On the other side, a monotheistic religion that claimed exclusive access to truth and viewed pagan practices as, at best, superstition, and at worst, demonic. The Church couldn't tolerate Samhain, but it also couldn't eliminate it. What happened instead was a long, complex process of suppression, appropriation, and transformation that created something new, the strange hybrid that would eventually become Halloween. Understanding this process reveals how cultural change actually happens, messy and incomplete, full of compromise and unintended consequences. Christianity spread through Celtic lands gradually. Some areas converted quickly, others resisted for centuries. But by the early medieval period, roughly 500 to 1,000 years after Christ, most of the formerly Celtic lands of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Britain had nominally Christian populations, nominally meaning officially Christian, but with all sorts of older practices still happening beneath the surface. The early medieval church faced a dilemma. How do you truly convert people who've accepted baptism but still practice pagan rituals? How do you eliminate beliefs and practices that are woven into the fabric of daily life, that meet deep psychological needs, that connect people to their ancestors and their land? The Church tried multiple strategies. Let's explore three: direct suppression, strategic replacement, and reluctant accommodation. First, direct suppression. Church authorities, especially in written edicts and sermons, condemned Samhain practices. They called them pagan, superstitious, evil. They forbade Christians from lighting bonfires, from wearing disguises, from leaving food for the dead, from consulting druids, or performing divination. Priests were instructed to identify and punish parishioners who continued these practices. In some areas, there were campaigns to root out Samhain entirely. This approach failed, not completely, but largely. Why? Because you can't suppress a need by declaring it sinful. People needed to honor their dead. They needed to mark the transition into winter. They needed communal gatherings. They needed rituals that acknowledge fear and loss and mortality. The church offered substitutes, which we'll get to, but in many rural areas, people simply kept practicing Samhain in secret or semi-secretly, with a nod toward Christianity, but maintaining the core rituals. Think about a Celtic farmer in Ireland around the year 700. He's been baptized. He attends Mass, more or less. But his grandfather's stories about Samhain night are deeply embedded in his understanding of how the world works. The local priest tells him that lighting a bonfire to protect against spirits is sinful. But his grandfather taught him how to do it. His neighbors all do it. His father did it. Does he really believe that suddenly, because the priest says so, the spirits aren't real? Does he want to risk not performing the protective rituals? Most likely, he does both. He attends church, and he lights the bonfire. This dual practice, Christian on the surface and pagan underneath, characterized much of Celtic Christianity for centuries. The church was frustrated but pragmatic, which leads to the second strategy, replacement. If you can't eliminate a practice, replace it with something Christian that serves a similar function. This was clever. Instead of just saying, stop doing Samhain, the church created Christian holy days that overlapped with Samhain, hoping people would transfer their attention from pagan festival to Christian feast. The key move came around the year 800, when Pope Gregory III established All Saints' Day on November 1st. Later, around the year 1000, All Souls' Day was added on November 2nd. These feast days served an explicit purpose: to Christianize the honor of the dead. All Saints' Day celebrated the holy dead, the martyrs and saints who now resided in heaven. All Souls' Day was for praying for the ordinary dead, the souls who might still need prayers to move from purgatory to heaven. Notice the timing. November 1st, the day after Samhain. This wasn't coincidence. The church was deliberately trying to overlay Christian meaning onto the same calendar moment. The hope was that people would shift from pagan Samhain to Christian All Saints and All Souls, maintaining the focus on the dead but within a Christian framework. This strategy partly worked. All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day became important in the Christian calendar. People did attend church on these days. They did pray for their dead relatives. They did light candles in churches for departed souls. The Christian framework provided its own rituals for dealing with death and grief. But here's what the church didn't anticipate. People didn't choose between Samhain and the Christian holy days. They did both. The night before All Saints' Day, October 31st, became known as All Hallows' Eve. Hallows meaning saints or holy ones. All Hallows' Eve. Say it quickly, and it becomes Halloween, and eventually Halloween. The church had created a Christian label for the night, but the practices that happened on that night remained stubbornly pagan. People went to church on November 1st for All Saints' Day. Then they went home and told ghost stories and left food out for spirits and wore disguises, just as their ancestors had on Samhain. Think about what this created: a hybrid festival, Christian in name and timing, but pagan in practice. The Church had tried to replace Samhain and instead had given it a new name and official legitimacy. All Hallows Eve became the container for all the old Samhain traditions. But now those traditions could claim to be part of Christian observance. This was not what the Church intended, but it was the practical result. The Church also tried to reframe the meaning of the practices it couldn't eliminate. Lighting candles, that's Christian symbolism, light pushing back darkness, representing Christ's victory over death. Honoring the dead, that's praying for souls in purgatory, a good Christian duty. Communal feasts, that's Christian fellowship and charity. By reinterpreting the practices rather than banning them, the Church made space for them to continue while claiming they were now Christian rather than pagan. This brings us to the third strategy, reluctant accommodation. In many rural areas, local priests simply looked the other way. They knew their parishioners were lighting bonfires and wearing disguises and practicing divination. They knew these were pagan holdovers, but they also knew that pushing too hard would alienate their congregation and might even drive people away from the church entirely. So they accommodated. They tolerated the folk practices as long as people also attended church, also followed Christian doctrine in other areas. This created a fascinating cultural layer cake. At the top, official Christianity. In the middle, folk Catholicism that blended Christian and pagan elements. At the bottom, pure pagan practices maintained in secret. Most people lived in that middle layer, genuinely Christian in their self-understanding, but also genuinely connected to pre-Christian traditions they didn't even recognize as pagan anymore. The practices had become so naturalized, so woven into the rhythm of the year, that they just seemed like what you do in late October. Consider the perspective of a village priest in medieval Scotland. He's trying to build Christian faith in his parish. He preaches against superstition. He teaches Christian doctrine. But when October comes and his parishioners prepare for All Hallows Eve with all the old Samhain rituals, what can he do? He can't police every home. He can't be everywhere at once. He can't eliminate beliefs and practices that people learned from their parents and grandparents. So he does what he can. He emphasizes All Saints' Day. He leads prayers for the dead. He tries to give Christian meaning to the impulses that drive the folk practices. And he hopes, over generations, the pagan elements will fade. They didn't fade. Instead, something interesting happened. The tension between official Christianity and folk practice created a rich, complex tradition that was neither purely Christian nor purely pagan. It was something new, born from the collision. The bonfires continued, but now people said they were honoring Christian saints, rather than warding off spirits. The costumes continued, but now they sometimes depicted saints or biblical figures alongside the old monsters and animals. The feast continued, but now they included Christian prayers and blessings. And here's the ripple effect. Because the church couldn't eliminate Samhain but also couldn't fully Christianize it, the festival maintained a dual nature that it still has today. Halloween feels both sacred and secular, both serious and playful, both ancient and modern. That duality comes directly from this medieval tension. The church tried to replace Samhain with All Saints and All Souls, but instead it created a 3-day sequence. All Hallows Eve on October 31st, All Saints' Day on November 1st, All Souls' Day on November 2nd, The pagan and Christian existed side by side, influencing each other, creating something hybrid. The church did succeed in eliminating some elements of Samhain. Druidic leadership disappeared. The explicitly polytheistic framework, the invocation of Celtic gods, faded. Human sacrifice, if it ever happened, certainly stopped. The other world was reinterpreted as either heaven, hell, or purgatory, rather than the Celtic realm of spirits and deities. But the core practices, the emotional core of the festival, survived. Why did the church's strategy of replacement only partly work? Several reasons. First, as mentioned, you can't eliminate a need by providing a different outlet for it. The need to honor the dead in specific traditional ways remains strong. Second, Christianity and Celtic paganism weren't as incompatible as the church claimed. Both believed in life after death. Both honored the dead. Both saw certain times as spiritually significant. The frameworks differed, but the basic orientation toward death and remembrance was similar. This made fusion easier than total replacement. Third, the church itself was inconsistent. Different bishops and priests took different approaches. Some were rigid and suppressive. Others were flexible and accommodating. This inconsistency meant that in some areas, Samhain traditions thrived under a thin Christian veneer, while in other areas they went deeper underground or actually faded. The result was regional variation. Ireland maintained stronger connections to Samhain than England. Rural areas maintained stronger connections than cities, but nowhere was it completely eliminated or completely Christianized. The medieval period also saw the rise of new folk beliefs that blended Christian and pagan elements. Stories about souls in purgatory, needing prayers mixed with stories about restless spirits walking the earth. Beliefs about guardian angels mixed with beliefs about protective ancestors. The idea that saints could intercede for the living mixed with the older idea that the dead could influence events. This theological hodgepodge wasn't systematic or official, but it was what most ordinary people actually believed. Consider the practice of souling, which developed during this period. On All Souls' Day, poor people would go door to door offering to pray for the dead of wealthy households in exchange for soul cakes, special pastries baked for the occasion. This was officially a Christian practice. But look at the structure. Disguised figures going door to door, receiving food in exchange for services, all happening at the liminal time of the year when the dead were especially present. It's Samhain guising in Christian clothing. The church created All Saints and All Souls to replace Samhain. Instead, it preserved Samhain by giving it Christian legitimacy and a place in the church calendar. This unintended consequence haunted church authorities for centuries. They kept issuing edicts against Halloween practices. They kept preaching against superstition. They kept trying to purify the festival of its pagan elements. And they kept failing. By the time the Protestant Reformation arrived in the 16th century, introducing yet another layer of religious conflict, All Hallows' Eve was deeply established in the annual rhythm of life in Ireland, Scotland, and parts of Britain. Different Christian denominations fought about many things, but they all struggled with the same problem. This festival that people loved, that met deep needs, that persisted despite official disapproval. The genius of folk culture is its adaptability. When the church said you couldn't honor pagan spirits, people said, fine, we're honoring Christian souls. When the church said you couldn't perform pagan rituals, people said, fine, these are Christian customs now. The outer layer changed, the names changed, the official explanation changed, but the core remained. At the end of October, the barrier between living and dead grows thin. We honor those who came before us, we protect ourselves with fire and disguise and ritual, and we feast together to celebrate survival and maintain community. The church tried to replace Samhain and instead transformed it. The name changed from Samhain to All Hallows Eve to Halloween. The gods became saints. The other world became heaven and purgatory. The Druids were replaced by priests, but the festival survived. And when Irish and Scottish immigrants brought their Halloween traditions to America in the 19th century, they carried this already hybrid festival, this strange mix of Celtic paganism and Catholic Christianity, to a new land where it would transform yet again. Next, we need to follow Halloween across the Atlantic and watch it become the secular commercial holiday that dominates October today. Every immigrant carries a homeland in their heart. They bring language, recipes, songs, stories, and festivals. When over 2 million Irish and Scottish people fled to America in the 19th century, escaping famine, poverty, and political oppression, they brought Halloween with them. What happened next is a story of cultural transplantation, adaptation, and explosive transformation. Halloween in America became something different from what it was in Ireland or Scotland, more secular, more commercial, more about entertainment than spirituality. But it also became more powerful, more widespread, more culturally dominant. Understanding this American transformation reveals how a small ethnic tradition can become a national obsession, and how a festival rooted in ancient death rituals can become a billion-dollar industry. The Great Famine in Ireland, beginning in 1845, drove waves of desperate Irish immigrants to American shores. They settled in cities like Boston, New York, Philadelphia. They worked hard, faced discrimination, struggled to survive in a new land. But they also maintained their customs. They spoke Irish or Irish-accented English. They cooked traditional foods. They told the old stories. And they celebrated Halloween. But Halloween in mid-19th century America wasn't yet a major festival. Most Americans, especially Protestant Americans, didn't celebrate it. They associated it with Catholic superstition. They viewed it as foreign, strange, potentially dangerous. The Irish and Scottish celebrated it within their communities, but it wasn't mainstream American culture. That would change. Let's explore 3 phases of Halloween's American transformation: ethnic festival, community celebration, and commercial phenomenon. First, ethnic festival. In Irish and Scottish neighborhoods, Halloween in the mid to late 1800s looked much like it had in the old country. Families gathered. They told ghost stories. They played games involving apples and nuts. Young people went guising, dressing in costume and going door to door performing songs or poems in exchange for food or coins. They lit bonfires when and where they could. They honored their dead, though often now within a Catholic framework of praying for souls rather than leaving offerings for spirits. These celebrations served multiple purposes for immigrant communities. They maintained connection to homeland traditions. They created social bonds within the ethnic community. They gave children a sense of cultural identity. They marked the passage of the year in a familiar way. When everything else about America was strange and difficult, Halloween was a piece of home. But American Halloween started absorbing influences from its new environment almost immediately. The Irish brought jack-o'-lanterns, traditionally carved from turnips or potatoes in Ireland. But America had pumpkins, large, plentiful, easy to carve. Within a generation, the pumpkin jack-o'-lantern became standard. This small change symbolizes the larger process. Take the traditional practice, adapt it to available resources, create something new. Americans also had their own autumn traditions that began merging with Halloween. Harvest festivals were common in rural America. Communities would gather to celebrate the end of the growing season with feasting, games, and entertainment. These festivals had no Celtic roots, no connection to honoring the dead, no spiritual dimension beyond general Thanksgiving. They were social celebrations of agricultural success. As Halloween spread beyond Irish and Scottish communities, it absorbed elements of these harvest festivals. The result was less spiritual, more social, more about community fun than about navigating the boundary between life and death. This brings us to the second phase, community celebration. By the early 20th century, roughly 1900 to 1930, Halloween was becoming an American institution. It was spreading beyond ethnic enclaves into mainstream culture. Middle-class Americans of all backgrounds were throwing Halloween parties. Children were trick-or-treating, though that exact term wasn't yet standard. Communities were organizing events. Schools were having Halloween celebrations. Why did Halloween spread so successfully? Several reasons. First, it was fun. The costumes, the games, the candy, the spooky stories, all of it was entertaining. Americans love entertainment. Second, it was socially useful. Halloween parties brought communities together. They gave young people appropriate ways to socialize. They created shared experiences. Third, it was becoming commercialized. Companies started making and selling Halloween decorations, costumes, and candy. Marketing pushed the holiday into American consciousness. But this spreading came with significant changes. Halloween was secularizing. The religious elements, both pagan and Christian, were fading. Most Americans celebrating Halloween in the 1920s had no idea about Samhain or All Saints' Day. They just knew Halloween was when you dressed up, had parties, and played pranks. The connection to death and the dead weakened. Halloween became about generic spookiness, rather than specific spiritual beliefs. Ghosts became cartoon characters, rather than the souls of actual dead people. Think about what was lost and gained in this transformation. Lost: the spiritual depth, the connection to ancestors, the ritual framework for processing grief and mortality. Gained: accessibility, fun, social bonding without requiring specific beliefs. Halloween became a holiday that anyone could celebrate regardless of religious background. This made it more inclusive, but also more shallow. The trick-or-treating tradition specifically evolved during this period. It came from the old guising practice, but it simplified and commercialized it. Instead of performing songs or poems, children just said trick or treat, offering the mild threat of mischief if not given candy. Instead of homemade treats, candy companies pushed their products. Instead of visiting neighbors you knew, children could range through entire neighborhoods. By the 1950s, trick-or-treating had become the central Halloween activity for American children. Now we reach the third phase, commercial phenomenon. After World War II, Halloween exploded into a major American holiday. Spending on costumes, decorations, and candy skyrocketed. By the early 21st century, Americans were spending over $10 billion annually on Halloween. Only Christmas generates more holiday spending. This commercial success transformed Halloween from a festival into an industry. The commercialization brought creativity and excess. Costume manufacturers produced elaborate, detailed outfits. Decorations became increasingly sophisticated, with animatronic figures, elaborate lighting, and theme displays. Haunted houses became professional attractions. Halloween parties grew larger and more elaborate. The holiday expanded from a single evening into weeks of celebration throughout October. Entire neighborhoods competed to create the most impressive displays. Think about this trajectory. Samhain was a sacred Celtic festival about death, ancestors, and survival. All Hallows' Eve was a hybrid Christian-pagan folk tradition. American Halloween became entertainment, commerce, and social celebration. The transformation was so complete that most people celebrating Halloween today have zero awareness of its origins. They know it's old. They know it has something to do with death and ghosts. But the specifics, the reasons, the beliefs that generated the practices, all of that is lost to the vast majority. Yet here's what's fascinating. Despite the secularization and commercialization, Halloween retained core elements that connect directly back to Samhain. Costumes and disguises, yes, though now representing superheroes and movie characters rather than spirits. Carved jack-o'-lanterns, yes, though now pumpkins rather than turnips, and more about decoration than protection. Gatherings and feasts, yes, though now parties with processed candy, rather than communal meals of freshly slaughtered meat. Ghost stories and horror, yes, though now movies and TV shows, rather than oral tales around bonfires. The forms changed drastically, but the underlying structure remained recognizable, and surprisingly, some deeper elements persisted in unexpected ways. Americans still associate Halloween with death, even if they don't honor specific dead relatives. The holiday aesthetics embrace skeletons, graves, ghosts, grim reapers, all the imagery of mortality. Horror films peak in October. People tell scary stories. There's an awareness, however dim, that Halloween touches something about our fear and fascination with death. The spiritual framework is gone, but death still haunts the holiday. Halloween also retained its liminal quality. It's still a boundary time, though now the boundary is more about childhood and adulthood, summer and winter, the ordinary and the extraordinary. It's a night when normal rules relax. Children stay up late. People wear costumes to work. Adults play at being scared. There's a carnival quality, a temporary inversion of normal life. This echoes the original liminal nature of Samhain, when the boundary between worlds thinned and anything became possible. The ripple effect of a Halloween's American success was global. Starting in the late 20th century, Halloween spread from America to other countries. It's now celebrated in over 30 countries. Japan has elaborate Halloween celebrations. Mexico blended Halloween with Dia de los Muertos. Europe, where Halloween originated, re-imported it as an American holiday. This global spread is ironic. A Celtic festival, suppressed by Christianity, transformed in America, exported back to the world as secular entertainment. The original spiritual content is lost, but the holiday thrives. Critics sometimes complain that modern Halloween is shallow, commercial, divorced from meaning. They're not wrong. Compared to Samhain, with its profound engagement with death and community, contemporary Halloween can seem trivial. But perhaps something valuable remains. Halloween still gives us permission to play with fear, to dress up, to gather with neighbors, to share sweets with children. It still marks the turning of the year toward darkness. It still lets us indulge our fascination with ghosts and death in a controlled, safe way. And for those who want deeper meaning, Halloween still offers it. You can honor your dead on Halloween. You can light a candle for someone you lost. You can tell stories about ancestors. You can use the holiday as an opportunity to reflect on mortality, memory, and connection across time. The commercial overlay doesn't prevent the spiritual core from being accessed by those who seek it. Halloween is what you make of it. The transformation of Samhain into American Halloween is a story of cultural adaptation, commercialization, and survival. A 2,000-year-old Celtic festival made it through Roman conquest, Christian suppression, and ocean crossing to become one of the most widely celebrated holidays in the world. The name changed, the practices changed, the meaning changed, but the festival endured. That's the power of culture, the resilience of tradition, the human need for festivals that mark important transitions and create shared experiences. Next, and finally, we need to step back and look at the legacy of Samhain today, at what remains, what was lost, and why it all still matters. You've walked through 2,000 years of history with me, from Celtic hilltops to American suburbs, from sacred rituals to commercial spectacle, from druids reading omens in sacrificial smoke to children collecting candy in plastic pumpkin buckets. Now it's time to ask, what does any of this mean for you today? Why should you care that Halloween has Celtic roots? What difference does it make to understand that your jack-o'-lantern descends from a practice meant to ward off malevolent spirits? The answer is this. Understanding where Halloween comes from helps you understand yourself, your culture, and the eternal human struggle to find meaning in death, darkness, and change. The legacy of Samhain isn't just historical, it's personal. Let's start with the obvious. Halloween is now a global phenomenon. Over 30 countries celebrate it in some form. The United States alone spends more than $10 billion on it annually, making it the second largest commercial holiday after Christmas. Millions of people participate in Halloween activities every year. Costume sales peak. Candy manufacturers gear up for months. Haunted attractions open. Horror films dominate theaters. For one night, and really for most of October, the world plays with fear and death and transformation. This success is remarkable when you consider how easily Halloween could have disappeared. It survived Roman conquest when many Celtic practices died. It survived Christian suppression when many pagan festivals were erased. It survived the ocean crossing when many immigrant traditions faded. It survived secularization when many holidays lost their non-religious audiences. Halloween is a survivor, and that survival suggests it meets needs that transcend any particular belief system. Let's explore 3 dimensions of Samhain's legacy: what remains, what was lost, and what it means going forward. First, what remains. The most obvious continuity is costumes. When you put on a Halloween costume, you're participating in a tradition that reaches back to Celts, wearing animal skins and masks to confuse spirits. The purpose has changed completely. You're probably not trying to avoid recognition by dangerous entities from the other world. You're trying to look cool or scary or funny. But the basic action, disguising yourself, transforming your appearance, becoming something other than your everyday self, that comes directly from Samhain. And there's still something psychologically powerful about it. When you wear a costume, you feel different. Children especially embody their costumes fully. The shy kid becomes a bold superhero. The gentle kid becomes a fierce monster. The costume creates permission to act differently, to explore other aspects of self. This transformative quality, this temporary escape from fixed identity, was central to Samhain and remains central to Halloween. Jack-o'-lanterns persist, evolve from turnips to pumpkins, but still serving as glowing guardians at thresholds. When you carve a face in a pumpkin and light a candle inside, you're creating a beacon, a marker of the boundary between inside and outside, safety and danger. The original purpose, protecting the home from spirits, is forgotten, but the practice continues, and there's still something satisfying about it, something that feels right even if you can't articulate why. The association with death remains, though transformed. Halloween aesthetics embrace skeletons, graves, ghosts, zombies, vampires, all the imagery of mortality. We've made death cute and cartoonish, turned terror into entertainment. But we're still engaging with death, still acknowledging it, still giving it space in our culture. In a society that often hides death away in hospitals and funeral homes, Halloween is one of the few times death becomes visible, speakable, present. Ghost stories and horror remain central. We tell scary stories around Halloween just as Celts told tales of spirits on Samhain night. We watch horror movies. We visit haunted houses. We seek controlled fear. Why? For the same reason. The Celts performed rituals on a dangerous night. Facing fear in a structured, limited way helps us manage it. Horror entertainment lets us experience danger without real risk, death without dying. It's therapeutic in its way, allowing us to process anxieties in a safe container. Community gathering remains important. Halloween parties bring people together. Trick-or-treating connects neighbors, at least briefly. Community haunted houses and events create shared experiences. We've lost the deep communal bonding of the Samhain feast, where the entire tribe gathered and told stories and honored the dead together. But we've retained the impulse. This is a time to come together, to share an experience, to strengthen social bonds. Now let's examine what was lost. The spiritual framework that made Samhain meaningful is mostly gone. Few people celebrating Halloween believe in spirits walking the earth. Few honor specific ancestors. Few see the holiday as a religious or spiritual event. Halloween for most people is entertainment, not meaning. This represents a significant loss. Samhain help people process grief, maintain connection with the dead, integrate death into life's rhythm. Modern Halloween mostly avoids genuine engagement with mortality. The connection to nature's cycle is weakened. Samhain marked a real agricultural and seasonal transition. It acknowledged that winter was coming, that survival depended on preparation, that humans lived within natural rhythms, not of their making. Modern Halloween happens mostly indoors, disconnected from farming, insulated by technology from the harsh realities the Celts faced. We've lost a visceral awareness that this festival marked a life or death transition. The Druidic wisdom, the vast oral tradition, the the sophisticated understanding of cycles and balance, all of that is lost. The Druids knew how to read signs, how to maintain connection between human and divine, how to guide communities through dangerous transitions. That knowledge died with them. We have entertainment and commerce. They had meaning and wisdom. The trade-off isn't obviously favorable.